Hello everyone, it's been a while since we've done one of these. It's Kelsey and Emily, and we're going to talk a little bit about the MSI events that have unfolded so far and the ones going in the future, so hopefully we'll have kind of a constant stream of videos. Our first one is just going to conclude the wrap-up of the first group of play-in, which allowed Gambit to advance on to the next stage of the play-in and play against EVOS and Flash Wolves, yes. So we're going to go ahead and cover how that group did, and then tomorrow we'll do a wrap-up of the other group. So even though the other teams have played, we're not going to talk about them today. No one likes those teams anyway. Just kidding. Just kidding. I know there are a lot of Brazilian fans who like Emily or something like that, so I'm not trying to hurt your feelings. Okay.
Oh, they didn't have the best performance, so I'm not sure if Brazilian fans would like what I have to say about the team, but anyway.
We're going to just quickly go through from bottom to top and talk a little bit about these teams and the games they played and what we think about them. Since I didn't really watch much wildcard overall throughout the course of the regular season, I'm a little bit in the dark, so Emily's going to fill in her expectations for what the teams are supposed to do or would have done and how they met them. We're going to go ahead and start with Ascension, the team that I think only won one game, or did they won the last one, right?
Two.
Yeah. They won the last one that apparently it didn't really matter because Gambit had already advanced. But they managed to win 2 games in the entire group stage. Some people predicted that Ascension would kind of bomb out, and other people thought that they would do a little bit better. What was your take on it, Emily?
So going in, I thought that their record would be a lot better, but then after day one, I also thought that their record didn't accurately portray how well the team performed. Like, they made a lot of Ascension mistakes where they try to push for something too hard instead of, like, taking the back, resetting, and then closing the game out in a more controlled way. But I think that the reaction has been a little bit odd to me because I actually thought that if you look at their, like, people are kind of shocked that they were able to beat Gambit, that they had a better performance on day 2. But if you look at their their games on the first day that they played, 2 of them were very, very close. And they could have easily won if, like, you know, they hadn't decided to kind of overreach in a few specific situations. So I already thought that they were better than their record showed, so I wasn't surprised to see them be able to defeat Gambit.
Yeah, I remember on the first day I thought there were actually more positives I saw in Ascension than Rainbow 7, which everyone was kind of projecting to be the #1 team in the group. I thought that they were really good at reacting when the enemy team, like, made a poor play and then taking advantage of missteps and macros, so they just, like, had very good reactive play to an extent. They were able to capitalize on, like, when the enemy team is pushed up on one side of the map and then there are 2 waves pushing against something on the other side, they could trade 2 lanes for 1. They could go and get Baron Vision. I think that they hesitated somewhat in the early game to pull triggers in certain scenarios, but overall they were a little bit too trigger happy in the late game. But yeah. I thought that they were an interesting enough team. I didn't think that they were just, like, completely and significantly worse than the other teams in the group. So
yeah. And then I'm trying to think, in the Gambit game, one of the things that really stood out to me, I believe it was this game, was that Kira went for the, like, banner push Karma. But I found that every time I looked, and maybe it's just when I looked, but most of the times when I looked at the side waves, Ascension did a really good job of pushing, like, making sure that their side lanes were always pushing before they were going for something. So that's something I noticed about them too, and also something that Gambit, especially since they're the team that's advancing, might want to take a look at before they face either EVOS or Flash Wolves.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily think that Gambit's macro was completely on point. What game are you talking about? Oh yeah, the banner.
The first game, yeah, the Ascension versus Gambit.
Yeah. So Yeah, I agree. They didn't really take advantage of the Fiora that well at all in that game. Like the benefit of the Fiora is that you're definitely going to be able to constantly get the push on the Camille. You should be able to sort of have that advantage. I think that the Fiora even got ahead early lane, which theoretically shouldn't be happening. So there were a few good things that I saw out of Ascension in that sense, because they didn't allow Gambit's like side lane heavy push comp to get off the ground. They used openings when Fiora wasn't pushing for Camille to group, utilizing the fact that Camille can both like group and team fight better than Fiora, but she can also lay some side lane pressure. So I thought that that was good. I think Fiora also screwed up her build a little bit. She went for Camille completed tabbies, and then Fiora was working towards her first item and only had components, so it wasn't, so she lost like the second duel. It was weird. Anyway, that's a random aside. But yeah, there were definitely some positives from Ascension. To me, they didn't feel like the worst team in the group. I actually thought, like, I would say first day Rainbow 7 and second day KLG were worse than Ascension overall. So
yeah, the thing that's kind of frustrating about evaluating Ascension at this tournament is, like, if they make one or two decisions differently, they suddenly get out of this group, in my opinion, because they 2-0 Gambit, first of all, and then they also they would have at least like a 4-2 record. So I think that it's unlucky that their record doesn't accurately reflect, in my opinion, how well they performed here. So hopefully people will take a look at their actual performance and not necessarily the win-loss. But
so the rest of the group kind of shaped out, I think, how people sort of expected. I thought Rainbow 7 were a little bit overrated, but a lot of people had Gambit over Rainbow 7 anyway, so it didn't really matter. KLG was the second best team after that. For me, like, obviously the standout player was Tierwolf, who I felt had a really, really good understanding of jungle tempo, but he didn't really track the enemy jungler that well. What were your thoughts on KLG going into the tournament before seeing them play at MSI?
So they actually performed better than what I thought. After I saw especially their finals, I was very concerned for this team because they had a very, very messy qualifying final that really, like you mentioned, Tierwolf, and that entire final was kind of like this weird like live or die by Tierwolf, depending on his decision making in the jungle and whether the rest of the team was there to back him up, because sometimes he, like you said, he needs to do a better job of tracking his opponents, but also sometimes it wasn't as bad as Audi, who we'll bring up later, but sometimes he goes for an aggressive invade in response to something accurately, but then the rest of his team won't have stuff set up either inside lanes or in mid, or won't have vision set up, and then he just dies, and then, you know, the other team is able to stumble off that. So that's also something that I saw happening. So when it happened here, it wasn't too much of a shock to me. Again, like, in my opinion, they actually did perform a lot better than I thought they would. I was expecting them to take like maybe one game, and not only did they take more than that, but they also looked just a lot better, more cohesive, and it looked like they had a better understanding of a lot of macro concepts, more so than a team like Rainbow 7, for example. So that was not something I was expecting, despite the fact that I put Rainbow 7 second in this group and Gambit first in like my when I was looking at this group previously. But yeah, they were kind of like a pleasant surprise, because I think they were able to show that yeah, they just had a stronger understanding of certain things than other teams, which I was not expecting based on their qualifying run.
I appreciated watching them today because it kind of helped me solidify what I thought were the strengths and weaknesses of KLG, because they didn't do as well on their second day, and it really kind of highlighted what they screwed up, which is a sense where they feel like they should react to plays by trading sides, but they're almost hesitant to commit to a play in that sense. So they'll they'll react by getting vision, but they won't like go for the Baron, for example, if someone's overcommitting on the bot side. They'll react by deciding to trade for camps if the enemy team is making a play on bot line, but the camps might not be up because they haven't tracked the jungler correctly. So they have this idea that, okay, we need to make something happen on the opposite side of the map, that if they're doing something on this side, but they don't always have it set up. They aren't always able to find something, but that's something that I think a lot of teams, even at this level, even at like LCS level, miss, is just this like constant, okay, we're going to play to our strong side. So they have this concept down, but they don't have the setup or the execution down very well.
Yeah.
There were quite a few things that I liked from Tearwolf the first day that I think he didn't get away with the second day, because it was just like, okay, he's reacting very well to invades by going to the other side of the map, but like, for example, Diamond is no longer invading level 1 on his strong side, he's invading level 1 if he has a push mid on his weak side. So we know that Tearwolf will path towards Diamond's weak side, which means that he's not going to get much from like the strong side. So in that sense, it's a much better setup, it's a much better invade, whereas Tearwolf was like countering Diamond's invade on the first day, for example. So I think that there are, when Diamond was like going for one buff but not countering the camps, and Tearwolf would just take his entire other side of the jungle. So I think that that kind of difference is something that we saw from their decisiveness, their understanding that we need to make something happen. It's just that the other teams realize, oh, okay, we need to have some defensive vision or something in place if we're going to make this play. And then KLG could no longer sort of get that trade-off.
Yeah. I thought they rotated Caitlyn better than Rainbow 7. Sorry. That was something that really frustrated me with them on day 1. But yeah, so shout out to KLG, I guess. It still wasn't perfect, but like in terms of when you play Caitlyn and what she wants to do, I feel like they also had better understanding of that to take turrets. But
well, let's move on to Rainbow 7, because I feel like that there were some things that they definitely did better the second day than they did the first day. Just in terms of things like, okay, we're not going to overcommit to one objective and ignore the waves on the other side of the map as much. We understand that like having consistent sideline pressure is going to help us execute something on this. Like this was one of the most frustrating things is watching these teams, is if you have a strong side laner, you're going to have better pressure on Baron if that guy is pushing hard bottom than if he's grouped with your team. I'm just throwing this out there. That's not gonna, they're just gonna take that 5v5 and kill him.
Just blanket advice.
By the way, generally speaking, like this is actually way more of a problem that I had with the other group, so we can talk about that tomorrow. But I think that they kind of fixed some of those problems going into the second day. So I do think that they adapted a little bit in terms of their macro play and their map setup, but it was just like in general not as high a level as we saw from Ascension or KLG. So they basically were getting to this point by, I felt like, Sia brute forcing things, having like good scaling comps and taking advantage of this predilection to 5v5 with something like Tristana or Caitlyn or something like that. So thoughts?
So this team is kind of frustrating because the only reason I put them below Gambit at the start is because in their qualifying run, they played a lot more around like Adi and Sia, and I didn't know how White Lotus coming in without having played with the team, despite the fact that he's played with this roster before, would affect the team's communication and stuff like that. And I think the still to this day, the most frustrating thing that I always see about Rainbow 7 is that their mid to late game, I think they're just so used to having these early leads that maybe they just don't get as much practice in terms of how to split pressure on the map or set up for certain objectives mid to late. So seeing that that's like they've evolved beyond like win lane win game, right? Which is what we saw from them in 2016, and that kind of became their undoing when they got to the like qualifying playoff part. But most frustrating thing is that even though they've evolved somewhat, that still hasn't been fixed to some extent. Their mid to late game decision making still hasn't been fixed in some regards. So that's kind of frustrating, just because this roster, despite the fact that they've improved, in my opinion, from how they used to see the game, there are still a lot of those holes that haven't been fixed. I think also Audi had, like, I know the different opinions of, like, players and junglers, especially if you don't watch the teams, like, fluctuates wildly, right? So, like, last time people were saying Diamond was washed up and he's shit and he's never going to be able to come back. And Audi, like, had some pretty interesting early pathing decisions that people were like, oh, Audi is, like, super, super good. And then that has completely flip-flopped in this tournament. And I will say that Audi had probably the worst tournament I've ever seen him play, which was unfortunate. I don't think he was deserving of as much hype as he received back last year at Worlds, but I do think some of the things that people were calling him out for, you could even see in a few of his games here where he would make a few early smart pathing decisions, but then after that, he didn't seem to have a good understanding of, again, just where to be on the map, or reacting to his opposing jungler after a certain point in time, communicating with his own lanes. It was a little bit better in day 2, but that's really what stood out to me, especially on day 1, was that he just had a really bad tournament. So there was that. White Lotus looked better with the team on day 2, just in terms of communication and how they wanted to play around him. Because I think on day 1, they definitely, like, I know I called out the Caitlyn, but, like, I feel like when you have a Caitlyn on the map, I'm so used to watching teams in the major regions really know what to do with that, right? Like, you push turrets and then you rotate her into a different lane and push turrets. And that's something that stood out to me with Rainbow 7 on their first day. But I think, to their credit, they did play a bit better around White Lotus, and he looked more comfortable and the team looked more comfortable on day 2.
Yeah, I think this is it. But for me, the alterations to Rainbow 7, like the games where they look the best, Audi isn't even necessarily involved. Like, bot lane is getting a first blood on their own, and they're really pressuring that side with rooms for mid lane and stuff like this, but it's really, like, Audi was out of sync. There were some things that he did that I thought were really good, but, he seemed to have a better sense in terms of being more consistently on the correct side of the map, on the strong side. But in general, it just felt like there was a complete disconnect on this team. Maybe they're just used to completely crushing and brute forcing or something like this. And then their last game setup was really strange to me, where they're basically just going in for this particular composition that has no lane pressure. So automatically, what do Gambit do? They identify that they can invade this, they can force on their mid laner, and they can get permanent mid priority and basically deny the entire map from Rainbow 7 early on. And they only basically have a way in because Tristana is a brainless champion once you get to 35 minutes into the game. So yeah, it was just sort of strange to me that this team has consistently had a lot of hype around it and a lot of expectation, and they always seem to fall just short. I think it might have something to do with the fact that they have occasionally scrimmed North American teams. I'm just gonna throw out there that if you're rating international performance and how well you think a team will do internationally by how they do on scrims against North American teams, you may want to reevaluate your criteria. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
One thing I'm just going to follow up on that, just because, again, when we've seen this team actually do really well, it's around their early game, right? So not just win lane, win game, but again, Audi makes some smart pathing decisions in terms of tracking his opponents early, and then usually they go for pushing lanes. And so that was also in the Gambit game really, really weird to see. And they, on day 1, if I remember, they had like another scaling comp, and I was just kind of like, okay, I get that you're trying to fit kind of like having the scaling hyper carry for White Lotus, but at the same time, you shouldn't sacrifice what your team is strong at and like give up those pushing lanes.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to the winning team, Gambit. That's come out of the group. Well, what did you expect from Gambit? It sounds like you thought that they were going to be first.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I just thought, so the strongest team, and we'll talk about them tomorrow, but going into this tournament, I thought the strongest team in the group stages was Supermassive. And then Gambit is behind them, but I put them at the top of this group because for the reasons I talked about why I didn't put Rainbow Seven at the top. And then I actually had Ascension as kind of like my dark horse, like maybe they'll make it out of the group if they perform really well. For Gambit, I think they have a pretty good understanding of like Diamond had. So first of all, I'm not as high as people are on Diamond right now coming out of this group stage, because again, like what I said about how people view players that they haven't seen in a while, and it's especially interesting with a player like Diamond who has so much history and what he's contributed to League of Legends since like season 1, season 2. But I do think he had some really good early games, and he reacted to his opponents very well. And I also think that outside of a few weird drafts, Gambit did come up with some interesting team compositions for their opponents that they could also play well, which I think is something. So like when you come to an international event, something I usually rip teams apart for is sacrificing their own play style for going for something super meta or something that's difficult to execute. And for the most part,
I don't care if they do that. I'm just gonna throw that out there. Like, if they're playing the meta and they can't play the meta very well, they've probably tried to play their own style in scrims and lost horrifically and decided, okay, we're going to learn the meta, but it's a little bit too late. So I don't really care if teams are not playing like the way they played in their own region, because the way they played in their own region was probably fucking bad. North America. Anyway, so
I think it's really difficult for especially wildcard teams to try to find a balance between this. And I think Gambit found a good balance. I don't know if it's because they are able to scrim some EUCS teams or even lower tier EU LCS teams. I don't know if they are or not. But I think that they came in with a good balance of being able to play things to the meta while also coming up with some unique and creative picks for specific opponents. Obviously, people are going to point out the Presence of Mind Karthus Nocturne game from day 1, but in day 2, we also saw Kira get Anivia, so you can see what he is able to do on that champion in terms of separating team fights. Again, Diamond performed really well. Lodic had a pretty good tournament. They shifted their focus to play more around him, going back to my point, because that is more meta, despite the fact that he's the newest player. So I think that was also a good look from them. They, in general, looked slightly better than what I thought they would look like, and a lot of that does have to do with Diamond. I wasn't sure how he was going to perform at this tournament, but I thought he had a really good showing in group stage.
My criticism of Diamond is basically that he is willing to sacrifice tempo for denial, and by that I mean he's willing to spend extra time taking camps from the enemy jungle, even if he could get more by backing first and having vision top so that the enemy jungle can't like gank or whatever. So he's really willing to do that, and he'll end up behind just in terms of like the overall rhythm of the game or information or stuff like that, just by trying to take some camps here and there. And he'll just be, in that sense, he's inefficient with his pathing because he spends a lot of time like walking back and forth across the river. So That's kind of my biggest issue. However, like, his ability to identify when he has those opportunities for invades is really strong. Like, when he knows he has a strong mid push, he'll almost always look for a camp. He'll almost always look for, okay, we can fight on strong side and we can make this happen. So I think that that's a really strong thing from Gambit. I think that Gambit are also more willing to kind of screw up what the enemy team wants to do to the detriment of their composition. And by that I mean, say they have like a Camille or something topside versus a tank, and then enemy team has like strong Jhin Leona lane or something like this. They would rather just like prevent the Jhin Leona lane from snowballing than from like playing to the win conditions of their own composition. So their mentality seems to be more to play against the win conditions of the enemy composition than their own. And the problems with that obviously are, like, you'll spend a lot of time on one side of the map trying to shut down the Jhin Leona or whatever, and they'll still have pressure because that matchup is just that good or something like that. So meanwhile, your Camille isn't getting to a point where she can take over in a side lane or anything of that nature. So that's kind of my big concern with Gambit going forward. Do you think that this is a team that will be able to beat Flash Wolves or EVOS?
So from what I've seen of Flash Wolves, no.
Okay.
I actually think Flash Wolves, despite the fact that I wouldn't really rate them highly when it comes to all of the major regions, because Flash Wolves are still, you know, kind of default #1 in Taiwan because of the way that the LMS is shaken out for the past, like 3 years now, outside of the one time that HQ won. But I think that, so I think they will have issues, especially since Maple is performing really well, and his communication synergy with Mujin has actually been really good. And also Betty, they've played really well around Betty, which is, like, Gambit are new to playing around their bot side relatively, just because they, you know, they swapped out blasting a little bit late. Lodic, they're just starting to really play around him due to the meta shifts, and I think that Flash Wolves just have that down so much better. With EVOS is an odd team because from what I've seen and also from what I've read about them, Jonathan Yee, who watched them throughout all of the split, has a really good article up on Esports Heaven that I recommend people read if they want to know more about EVOS. But the interesting thing about them is that their bottom lane is probably like the weaker point on the map. So that would be an interesting matchup for Gambit, because despite the fact that Lodic looked really good, and I'm not super sold on PvP stay host as like a super strong top laner. I think if they put him on tanks, he's fine. And I don't think that Gambit as a team is still as used to playing around bot lane as they are through snowballing mid jungle or maybe playing topside a bit more. So that would be an interesting matchup, to be honest, the EVOS Gambit matchup. And that would be their closest chance, I think. I still see EVOS beating them out, but it wouldn't be like a huge surprise or shock to me if Gambit managed to make it if they end up facing EVOS.
So you're saying Vietnam were correctly promoted to independent region status, despite the fact that Riot probably only did it to save NA from playing this round of play-ins?
I didn't even think about that. But EVOS does a lot of interesting things. So, you know, it's like, it's Stark and Slay's revenge tour, which is also kind of hilarious. Not really, but since they were previously part of Gigabyte Marines, if people remember from MSI last year, they were part of that roster. So, again, like I think it would be a lot closer of a matchup, but I'd be curious to see how both teams end up playing around their bot lanes.
Sure, we'll talk about these matchups a little bit more when we know which ones are which after tomorrow. But
yep.
Thank everyone for watching, and hopefully tomorrow's games will be really fun. Though I personally feel like this group is a bit better, so
I would agree with that.
Anyway,
I'm sorry.
thank you guys, and we'll have another video out tomorrow.
Woo!